All right, so we're recording now. Welcome back to our Friday night Bible study, continuing in Daniel chapter 2. We're going to get to the interpretation of the dream tonight. Before we do that, let's begin with a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the opportunity to get together to study your word. We ask that you will be with us in our study, send your Holy Spirit to guide us, give us wisdom and understanding, Lord, and help us to see the truths that you have hidden that may draw us closer to you. We thank you for asking these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Before I move the slides forward, can anyone remind us of where we left off last week?
Right before he interpreted the dream.
Okay. Right before he had interpreted a dream. Remember the king had a dream that bothered him greatly. He couldn't remember the details of the dream, but he wanted to know what the dream was and what the interpretation of the dream was. Of course, all his wise men couldn't help him. He got mad, issued a death decree for all the wise men. Of course, they came to get Daniel and his friends because they were wise men. Daniel begged for more time. Well, didn't beg. He asked for more time so that he could give him the interpretation. And he used that time to get his friends together, and they had a little prayer meeting. God revealed the dream to Daniel, and he came in now to give that interpretation, and that's where we're going to pick up. So this is chapter 2, the God who reveals the future, part 2. Let's take a look. Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 to 29 to start it off. I believe we read these last week just before we stopped. So, and I'll read these, and then from here on, I'll be asking for volunteers. So y'all be ready. So Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. I say through 29, yes. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. In other words, thoughts of the future. And he who reveals secrets had made known to you what will be. All right, so reading through that. Now Daniel said in here, what did he say about the wise men, the astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers?
They could not give him the answer.
They could not give him the answer, right? And what was Daniel's job description? Do you remember?
A wise man.
He was one of the wise men, right? We said he was a level 1 wise man, right? An intern, so to speak, at this point. This was very early in his career, right? So he was admitting that he and all his co-workers were incapable of answering the king's question. But who did he say could?
God.
God, you're right. He was very specific, not just God, but the God in heaven. Okay, so it's God with a capital G. Right? So, which brings about an interesting question. Do you think there may have been a temptation to take credit for being able to reveal the king's dream?
Probably. I mean,
It's a temptation now.
There was a temptation
for Daniel. Was it a strong temptation?
No. Because he immediately praised God once he got the interpretation. He didn't go running off immediately to claim credit. He praised God first for giving it to him, giving the interpretation to him before going to find, what was his name, Ariot.
Okay. So yeah, Daniel may have had a temptation, but at this point, he's already developed that relationship with God where it probably wasn't real strong. The devil's going to throw temptations at you no matter how well connected you are to God, but a lot of them are just not going to carry much weight simply because they're just not that big a deal to you because of that relationship. Now, if we think about it, what would have been the rewards and or consequences for Daniel? So let's start with the rewards. if Daniel had given into that temptation to take credit for the dream and its interpretation, God had given it to him. So he already had the answer. What would have been the rewards he might have gotten?
Higher positions in the court than what he had, plus other finery, whether it be jewelry or what have you, or clothing, any number of things.
Any number of things. He could have had himself a really nice apartment there in the palace instead of his house somewhere out in the city. Finer clothing, servants, position of wealth. Nebuchadnezzar was the ruler of the wealthiest nation on the planet. He had at his disposal unlimited wealth, basically, from human terms. All right, what would have been the consequences to Daniel if he had done that?
His relationship with God would have faltered.
All right, the relationship with God, that would have damaged that relationship quite a bit, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And damaged his relationship with his friends.
Friends, because who helped him?
His friends.
His friends did, right? They were there in that prayer meeting. It wasn't just Daniel on his own that got this interpretation. What else? What other consequences? This one's maybe a little bit harder, but what about his integrity?
Well, yeah.
That would have been flushed away. And it's his integrity that gets him through some trials later in the book. His integrity is what allows God to use him the way he does. So keep those things in mind. Anytime the temptations comes along, there's always a reward, but a lot of times you'll see that the consequences are going to outweigh those rewards. So Satan likes to throw some things out there just to show you some immediate rewards, temptations, to get you to do things. It may seem expedient, but they're usually not going to be beneficial in the long run. All right. So it says, humility and selflessness characterize God's faithful remnant then. So Daniel and his friends. And it must characterize his final remnant now. So if we want to emulate Daniel and his friends, if we want to have the kind of success that they had in just being an effective witness to the people around them, just by their very lives, then we have to exemplify these type of things. We have to have humility. We have to have selflessness and that closeness with God. It has to be all of God and nothing of self. Right? He must ever increase that we may always decrease. I misspoke. There is a spelling. You saw it right there. So what does this mean to you? That he must ever increase that we may always decrease?
It's not about what we do and what rewards we may have, but how we give it to God, and he is the ultimate giver and benefactor of everything that we do, and we should give him the credit rather than trying to take credit for ourselves.
So the biggest question you should ask whenever you're making a decision is, will this glorify God?
Right.
If it's not going to glorify God, do I need to do this? And I'm not talking about, do I eat a banana or an orange? Not that kind of decision, but any kind of serious decision, is this going to glorify God? So remember, our goal here is to build his kingdom, not to build our kingdom. Now, what did Daniel say was the focus of the dream? I believe that was in verse 29. It says, as for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this.
Those upcoming events. Sure.
Future events, right? So this was going to be the focus was the future. what was going to become of everything that Nebuchadnezzar had built. So wherever this dream may begin, and notice here he says, in verse 28, he says, he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Whatever the dream begins, it ends in the latter days. Now, when you think of the latter days, what do you normally think of?
End of time, right before the second coming.
In the time, okay, just before the second coming. So the final events of this Earth's history, right? The last days on planet Earth. So this dream takes us down the corridors of time to the very final days of Earth's history. Now, if I could have someone read verse 30, and Daniel's going to tell us why the interpretation was given to him.
I can do
Verse
that.
30.
Verse 30, all right.
Okay, can read it. But as for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living. But for our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart.
All right, so he says there, why was the interpretation given to him?
Because he has more wisdom than any living being.
No, so
No.
that's not, he's not been revealed because he had more wisdom.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't have, but when you read Daniel 1:17, or where'd I find that? Where Daniel acknowledges, 1:17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So even though he's saying, it's not his wisdom, God did give him wisdom in verse 17.
God did give him wisdom, but notice he's saying here, he didn't give this to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living.
Right.
Remember,
Yeah,
the king himself was the one that said that Daniel and his friends were 10 times
Right.
wiser than all the others.
but he did have more wisdom than
says-
everybody else, as it turns out.
Yeah,
Says, but for our sakes, he make known the interpretation to the king. So it's like he gave the interpretation to Daniel to save those, because the king
Oh,
was going
right.
around killing people, having
Right.
people killed because they couldn't tell him what the interpretation. So God gave the interpretation to save Daniel and his friends' lives, it
Right.
sounds like.
right. It says,
Right,
for
right.
our sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king. And specifically, who was that?
Daniel, his friends, the
Dan-
other wise men.
Daniel and his 3 friends, not the other wise men.
Well, Daniel and his 3 friends, because it said Daniel and his 3 friends who got the interpretation.
Yeah, God did not give the interpretation to Daniel to save the other wise men. Although
They
we
did.
did point out that Daniel did tell the king to stop killing the wise
Told
men,
area.
or told Arioch to stop killing the wise men, because he had the dream. All right, and then what was the other reason he gives?
And so that they would know what was happening. So the king would know what the thoughts of his heart was. Another version I've got here says that he wants you to understand what was in your heart.
So God gave the interpretation to Daniel to benefit the king. Because the king had concerns, God was answering those concerns, and he wanted the king to understand the message. So he gave the interpretation to Daniel to benefit Daniel and his friends, to protect them, and also to answer the questions that the king had. Okay. All right, now let's actually read the description of the dream. So Daniel 31 through 35. Who would like to read that for us?
I got it.
Nicole? Okay.
You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
Right. So now let's put yourself in Nebuchadnezzar's place as you hear Daniel describing the dream to him. How do you think King Nebuchadnezzar felt when he heard his dream repeated back to him?
Possibly some relief, because if he couldn't remember the dream here, like saying he knows he's worried about it, but he can't remember why he's worried about it. And here's Daniel telling him the dream. He's thinking, yes, finally, that's it. Somebody, yeah, there it is.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about it's kind of a sense of relief that it's like it's coming back to him. And a bit of excitement too, because, hey, there's someone here who actually knows what he's doing.
You think as Daniel was describing what was happening, the fog was kind of lifting?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I imagine the fog had to have lifted, or there'd have been no way the king could have verified that, yes, that was a dream.
Yeah.
So, and we know that it was God that gave him the dream. It was God that hid the dream from him after he gave it to him. And it's God that's revealing the dream again. So, yeah, I could imagine that, how that may have felt as that was just, that fog was lifting and he was suddenly getting the clarity about what he saw. Now, how do you think he may have responded?
Where did I go?
Well, one, he was you were talking about earlier, Bob, he was astonished that someone could relate the dream. Then he would want to know what it meant as far as the symbolism of the statue.
Yeah, you can see, I like this picture that's here on the slide. As you notice the king on his throne, is he sitting way back and relaxed, kind of like I am in this chair, or is he on the edge of his seat?
He's on the edge of the seat, kind of leaning
He's on the edge
forward.
of the seat. As Daniel's relating this, you can see he's probably moving forward and forward. And I can almost imagine when Daniel was done, him jumping up and saying, "That's it."
Mhm.
Getting real excited. Once the king heard Daniel describe what he had dreamed, how confident do you think he would have been in Daniel's ability to provide the interpretation?
Very.
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 Yeah.
Remember, all the other wise men said, it's impossible for us to tell you what you dreamed. Only the gods can do that. And now Daniel did it. So if Daniel did something that the other wise men said only the gods could do, surely he'd give him the interpretation. He would have no reason to doubt him. Now, here's some interesting thing that the book brings out. Some people say that Bible prophecy is just a matter of personal interpretation. I think we've all heard that. That we can make a prophecy mean whatever we think it should mean. We can read anything we like into it. I know I didn't read it the way it's printed there. And we see that a lot, I know, when we were doing our Revelation Bible study. There's a lot of crazy ideas out there about what a lot of these things are, but when you get down to it and you look through what actually happened, its history, and what the Bible says all these different symbolisms mean, there's generally just one sequence of events that actually fits the prophecy so that it actually makes sense. A lot of the things people try to put out there don't make any sense at all. If you're just trying to put your own spin and make it fit what you want it to make, there's going to be a lot of holes in it. It's not going to make sense. Also, a lot of times in the Bible, you'll see where God will give a prophecy and then he'll give the meaning of the prophecy. He'll explain it. He does that a lot. You also see that with, for example, Jesus' parables. He normally would give the parable to the public and then he would give the interpretation to his disciples in private. And God would do that with his prophets. He would have them give a prophecy that would be publicly done, and then he would give them the interpretation, right? But doesn't it make sense that the God who gave the prophecy would also provide the correct interpretation of the prophecy? Do you think God would just throw all these prophecies out there if he didn't want us to know what they meant?
No.
Nope.
No, it wouldn't make any sense at all. Why would God do something like that? Now, what do you think the king's main concern was regarding this prophecy?
Wanted to know what it meant.
Wanted to know what it meant in particular, right? Remember his position, he's the king of the world empire at this point in time. He's ruling all the known world at that point in time, what he knew the world to be. And he had just consolidated his power. So what did he want to know?
Make sure it wasn't a threat. It wasn't foretelling a threat to his
Make sure it
kingdom,
wasn't foretelling a threat.
to his kingdom. Because I mean, if he just got it situated, I mean, he wants to make sure it's gonna be there for a while.
Okay. He wants to make sure it's going to last. If you ever build a house, you want some assurance that it's going to last for a while, right? Anyone ever built a house?
Yep.
Yeah. It's a big investment, right? You don't want to build that house and then have it go away in 2-3 months, right? That would be crazy. It's a major investment. So he wanted to make sure that his kingdom was going to last.
And he probably wanted to know what his enemies were up to.
Probably he might have very well been wondering about that stone, because I mean
Yeah.
the statue.
That comes and destroys the statue.
Yeah, the statue I imagine probably resembled him a little bit, which would just make sense. But he's wondering about, is this a sign of an attack that's coming?
Mhm.
Well, let's talk about the dream now. How many parts did the statue have? What were they made of? Now you can see the slide kind of helps break up the parts because they're different colors. But how many parts did it have?
5.
5, all right. What were they?
Well, the head, the chest and arms, the belly and thighs, the legs and the feet.
All right. All the way down. And do you remember what the metals were?
Yep.
All right.
Head
Head
was
was-
gold,
Chest and arms,
silver,
belly and thighs,
bronze,
legs.
iron,
What about the feet?
Iron
iron and clay.
Iron and clay. Now, if you were going to build a statue with all these precious metals, would you make the feet of iron and clay?
No,
Doesn't sound very stable, does it?
they don't mix together well.
No, they don't. All right, so there's the metals. Now, keep in mind these different metals as we go through what this all means. We're going to talk about why these particular metals are appropriate symbol for this part getting into. And then what happens to the statue?
It gets destroyed,
Dark
Like-
colors.
utterly
And
destroyed
how does it get destroyed?
by a rock that's cut off from a mountain by no human hand.
Okay, so it's a supernatural, right? The rock is cut out of a mountain without human hands, so no human is doing this, which would indicate who is
God.
God,
God. Okay. So it's a supernatural, and then where does the rock strike the statue?
on the feet.
Okay. On the feet, not the head, not the chest, or two of the places you would think if you were going to attack somebody and you wanted to put them down, you'd go for the head or the chest, unless you're fighting dirty. But that's where all the vital stuff.
But the feet are its weakest points because of how it's mixed together. It's the iron and clay that doesn't really hold together. So
Yeah, on this statue,
on
yeah,
this
the feet,
statue anyway, the feet are its weakest point.
the feet are the weakest points. But there's a meaning why that rock strikes it on the feet. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, so now let's read the interpretation, Daniel 36 through 38. And see who would like to read those.
I'll read it.
All right, go ahead.
This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, O king, art the King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength and glory. And whosoever the children of men dwell, and the beast of the field, and the fowl of the heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold.
All right, so the head of gold, it says here, now represents Nebuchadnezzar. He's the head of gold. That's what he tells us here. And notice he said there in verse 37, He called him a king of kings because he had conquered other kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So who gave the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar?
God.
God,
All right, now think about that. How would all this make Nebuchadnezzar feel? Think he might have
Maybe-
mixed feelings?
Well, if he's the head of gold, he's gonna feel pretty proud, like, hey, I'm like the best thing out there. I'm represented by the most expensive element.
Pretty good. I mean, he's represented by gold, which is great. It does call him a king of kings, but remember, Nebuchadnezzar is a very prideful man who had believed he had built all this with his hands. And who does Daniel say gave it to him?
God.
God. In other words, this isn't your doing, this is God's doing. Pretty bold statement to a man who is living under a death sentence at this point in time. Come out and tell him that you didn't build this kingdom, God gave it to you. Right? But you are that head of gold. Now, initially, that part of it, I'm sure he liked. You know, he's the head of gold. You know, that's the most expensive of the metals, the most valuable of the metals, and he's the head of, you know, which usually that's where the rulership is and all of that. But nagging at the back of his mind had to be that little bit about God gave this to you. But there's going to be more. It says here now, did the head of gold represent the king or the kingdom?
Kingdom.
We know it represented the whole kingdom because we've read the whole thing. But at this point in time, Nebuchadnezzar is likely to think it's just him
Right.
because he said, you are the head of gold.
Yes, in verse 38 says, you are this head of gold,
Yeah,
which would make him think, oh, I personally, not his kingdom.
right. So you have to read more into it. And this is important things. You can't take it out of context. If we stopped right there, Nebuchadnezzar's the head of gold, and this is all about him. But it's not all about him. You have to read on. So you've got to be careful when you're reading passages in the Bible. You don't take just one or two verses and take it to fit your own particular meaning. You have to read it in context. So let's continue. You see here, God was giving Nebuchadnezzar a summary of world history and of successive kingdoms that would be world powers from his day down to the very end of time. Babylon ruled from 605 to 539 BC, which you look at it, is not really a long time. You know, it's less than 100 years. We already stated that, you know, Daniel served under Nebuchadnezzar, his son, his grandson, and then under Darius, and then Cyrus, who came in and conquered Babylon. So he served under 5 different kings in this, well, in a little bit more than this, because he served after Babylon fell. All right, so who were the next 2 kingdoms? Let's take a look at verse 39. And who can read that for us?
I'll read it.
All right, go ahead.
But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth.
All right, so there's going to be a kingdom that's going to defeat him, that's inferior to him. And then there's going to be another kingdom after that. So now, do we know who defeated Babylon? Media Persia, under the leadership of Cyrus, which we'll read in a later chapter. We'll get into that. We're going to get into a little bit tonight, but Daniel actually records some of the events that were going on in Babylon the night it fell. All right, and then who defeated the Persians, the Medes and the Persians?
Greece.
Greece.
Okay. Alexander in particular, right? He was the one, right? So those were the next 2 kingdoms. Daniel's interpretation of the image doesn't name the kingdoms here in this passage. Doesn't name the kingdoms that would follow Babylon on the world stage, but in Daniel chapter 8, he identifies those 2 as Media Persia and Greece. He specifically names both of those countries in there. Now, bear in mind, Media Persia was probably a rising power at that point in time. It may have been on the radar, but Greece wasn't on anybody's radar. At this point in time, Greece was just a loose confederation of city-states that spent most of their time fighting each other. Right? There was no clue by anyone that they were ever going to be a serious threat to anyone. So how did Babylon fall? We're going to turn to a couple of texts in Isaiah here. And we're going to see a prophecy concerning the fall of Babylon. So the first one is Isaiah 45, 1 and 2. And who would like to read that?
I'll read it.
Rosemary's got that one. And then I need someone ready with Isaiah 44, verses 24 through 28.
I can do it.
Jerry's got that one? Okay. Rosemary, you go first.
Okay. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him and loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron.
All right, so notice here, Isaiah is naming Cyrus by name. This is 100 years before Babylon fell. Now, I don't know how old Cyrus was when he actually took Babylon, but I bet he was less than 100 years old. So more than likely, he wasn't even born yet. And Isaiah names him by name. Now let's read, Jerry, can you read chapter 44, verses 24 through 28?
Yes. Thus saith the Lord, thy Redeemer, and he that formed thee from the womb. I am the Lord that maketh all things, that stretcheth forth the heavens alone, that spreadeth abroad the earth by myself, that frustrateth the tokens of the liars, and maketh diviners mad, that turneth wise men backward, and make their knowledge foolish. That confirmeth the word of his servant, and performeth the counsel of his messengers, that saith to Jerusalem, thou shalt be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah, ye shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof. That saith to the deep, by dry, and I will dry up the rivers. That saith of Cyrus, is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thou foundations shall be laid.
All right, interesting. He mentioned Cyrus again here. And this is actually the first mention of Cyrus, because 44 comes before 45. But notice what he said in there about the rivers were drying up. And he said that Cyrus would say Jerusalem, would be built, the foundation laid for the temple. Interesting is Cyrus is the one that issues the order to rebuild Jerusalem. He's the one that issues that first order for them to go back. Now, he's not the one that issues the order to rebuild the temple. That's later, but he's the one that issues the order to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. I imagine Daniel probably had something to do with that, but that's a later topic. All right, but so notice what he said there. There's some very specific things Isaiah said. Now he said, first of all, let's talk about the rivers drying up. We already talked about this one. So more than 100 years before Cyrus was born, God named him as the man who would overthrow Babylon. All right. We're going to get to this question in a minute. So Cyrus, when he laid siege to Babylon, now Babylon was a huge city, massive walls, no way they were going to break through the walls. It was said that I think Babylon, they estimated could hold, they had enough supplies in there to withstand 20 years. No army can sustain a siege for 20 years, especially in this region, which is mostly desert. There's just no way for them to keep the army fed that long. No supply chain. It just did not have the capabilities back then. Right. But what Cyrus did, he dug some channels off the side of the rivers. He found a dried up lake bed, which oddly enough, the Babylonians had actually built to fill up with water. So they had done this before, diverted the water into this lake bed so they could float boats on it and have like little, I don't know if they were doing war games or what it was, but there's been some historical references that the Babylonians did that. Well, he found that old lake bed and the channel, so he just went back, dug it, had his men dig out the channels and just left a little wall. And then when he was ready, he had them knock down that wall. The waters from the rivers flooded down those channels and into the lake bed instead of down the river to Babylon. So the water levels dropped. Now Babylon, the river went right through Babylon. They had this big gate where the water came through. So that would keep people from coming down the river in boats and ships. But there was a gap between the bottom of the gate and the riverbed because no one's going to go under that. There just was no need for them to go all the way down. Well, once the water quit flowing, Cyrus took his troops and marched right under the gate into the city. Now, the interesting thing, there was a second line of defense in the city because they knew that the river gates were their weak point. If you got through that, there was more walls along the banks of the rivers, the huge bronze gates that were barred and sealed. Normally, on the night that Cyrus did this, those gates were open. Those gates were open because there was a drunken party going on in Babylon, led by the king of Babylon at that point in time, who was in the middle of having a big party on his last night on earth. And the guards were drunk. Cyrus basically walked in, took the place without a fight. Because the guards were drunk, everyone, because they didn't think they had any reason to fear. And you notice in those texts we read, God makes mention of drying up the riverbeds, the gates being unlocked. Right? He talked about he'd get rid of the
Crooked places straight.
crooked places straight, right?
You'll
So
break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron.
cut the bars of iron. So the iron gates were not a thing because they just went right under.
Yeah.
So God took those out of the equation. So there's some very specific details in there about how Babylon was going to fall, about who was going to do it. Now, when you put all that together, and remember that this was all written 100 years before the event, what does that tell you about God?
He knows the future.
Right? He knows the future. He knows what's going to
And
happen.
he has plans that are gonna come through.
What does that tell you about God's plans?
They're sure they're gonna happen. You can
Okay.
trust in them.
They're going to happen. If God says something's going to happen, is it going to happen?
Yep.
Yes.
Isn't that Iraq? We're talking about Babylon, which is now over in Iraq, right?
Right.
What have archaeologists found things over there too that confirm? I'm sure they
Yes.
probably have.
Yeah, there's other prophecies going back to Isaiah that states that Babylon would be ruins and would never be rebuilt, and Babylon hasn't been. Right now,
All
it's a place that only people you ever catch there. There are nomads that occasionally wander through that live there, but for the most part, it's a place where wild animals are.
Which is what it said.
Yeah,
That
Well,
was the-
And
Now, we
that's
do know-
amazing. That's amazing that he said it would never be inhabited again. And here we are, 2021, it hasn't been.
it hasn't been. You know, Saddam Hussein wanted to rebuild it
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
prove the Bible wrong.
That
And-
didn't work out for him.
Yeah, no, that didn't work out well for him at all. So, you know, when God says something's going to happen, it's going to happen.
Right. Mhm.
Right? Take that to the bank every time. God knows the future. Nothing surprises him. Now, we might be surprised. God is not. And while some of the things that happen may not be something we can understand, we know that there's a purpose for it. God knows what it is. You just have to trust. All right. So let's move on now to the next one. What happened to Media Persia? Now, Media Persia, their reign was only half a verse in this prophecy.
Yeah.
So, and they actually ruled for considerably longer than that, but half a verse. What happened to Media Persia? Do we know how they fell?
Greece.
They were thrown by Greece.
Greece.
Alexander.
Alexander,
Yep.
in 3.5 years, conquered the known world at that point in time. And bear in mind that he did this with foot soldiers. You imagine the marching that those men had to do. And it said when he got to the Indian Ocean, I think he got to the coast, and he wept because there was no more land for him to conquer.
Hmm.
But he was brilliant commander. He inspired unwavering loyalty in his men. There's one story where he came to a city with thick walls, and he just he basically told the people holding the city, he says, watch this, and he orders his men, he says, walk off the cliff to your death. And they walked off the cliff to their death because he told them to do it. And he says, if I command this kind of power amongst my men, imagine what I can do to you. And they surrendered without a fight. Without a fight. So Greece followed Media Persia. Now, why was bronze a proper metal to use for Greece? You know that that time that Greece ruled was known as the Bronze Age,
Bronze Age,
right? It was the Bronze Age. You know why it was called the Bronze Age?
because it was it the weapons were made.
The weapons and armor in Greece were made from bronze.
I seem to remember that in our history book.
Yeah.
It's been a few years.
Now, Nebuchadnezzar, remember, his kingdom was represented by gold. Why was gold appropriate symbol for his kingdom?
It's a very rich nation.
Strongest.
Extremely rich. It was strongest, but it was the wealthiest nation probably ever on the face of the earth. In Babylon, there was gold everywhere. The temple of Marduk, the idol sat on a throne of gold. It wasn't gold plated, it was gold.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's just, and we know when we read the next chapter, in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar builds an idol that's what I think approximately 90 feet tall, and it's made of gold.
Mm.
So there was gold everywhere. Right. Now with Media Persia was not as wealthy as Babylon. They're represented by silver. Now, if you were to take a guess, what do you think was the main coin used in Media Persia?
Silver.
Silver.
I would guess silver.
Silver was their main currency in Media Persia. Right. So bronze was a proper metal to use to represent Greece because, again, they had the bronze weapons, the bronze armor. It was like when their army came in, it was like a sea of bronze flowing across the plain. So it was probably a sight to behold. Imagine very shiny too. So Media Persia ruled from 539 to about 331 BC, so about 200 years. A good long time. About 3 times as long as Babylon did. Greece ruled from 331 to 168 BC, not quite 200 years. All right, now what happened to Greece?
Rome took it over.
All right, Rome took it over, but interesting thing, Alexander,
Well, that's true.
he died at a very young age.
20 something
So
years
he
before
gave
he died.
He gave his kingdom to his 4 generals.
His kingdom was divided. He didn't have an heir. His kingdom was split up amongst his 4 generals. And they managed to hold things together as that kind of loosely knit, pack, until they started doing a little bit of infighting together. And then that allowed the next nation to come in. We'll get to them in a minute. But there's some interesting things here. Alexander and Jesus both died at the age of 33. One had all the kingdoms of this world, but died having nothing of any real value. And that would be Alexander, right? The other had nothing in this world. Remember, Jesus didn't have any worldly possessions, but died victorious, having everything of real value. By his death, he won the world. The only thing that matters is the assurance that your life is safe in God's hand and that you will live forever with him in his kingdom. And Jesus had that assurance. Alexander did not. Alexander died suddenly, weakened by malaria and overcome with alcohol. Oddly enough, at the time that happened, he was in the process of trying to build a new capital at Babylon.
Mhm.
Funny how things work. His kingdom was divided among his 4 generals, and then in 168 BC, the Roman Empire conquered Greece at the Battle of Pydna. I believe that's how you pronounce that. So the next kingdom that comes on the scene is Rome. So Rome is represented by legs of iron. Let's read verse 40 and see what it has to say about Rome. But who would like to read that for us?
Do it.
All right, Nicole, go ahead.
And the 4th kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others.
All right, it sounds a little ruthless,
Rome was a
right?
little
Because
ruthless.
crushes everything. Rome was incredibly ruthless. When Rome came in, we talked about Babylon. When he took the captives in, he tried to school them, educate them into their ways of doing things so that they could go back and rule in his stead. It was a somewhat friendly arrangement. Rome, not so much. When they came in, they crushed everybody. All the opposition was crushed. They would put in place their own ruler. They didn't care about locals. They would appoint somebody, usually a Roman, to rule that area. In any opposition or anything that even moderately resembled anything like opposition immediately was dealt with in a very harsh manner. It was the Romans that created crucifixion, which is probably one of the most gruesome ways to die that we've ever come up with as far as man goes. But in this one, now this is where we got to where the question was on number 16 on the worksheet where I had it messed up. So thank you for pointing that out. Why was iron a proper metal to use to represent this kingdom?
Strong, unbreakable.
Strong, unbreakable. You know that the
Unbreakable.
legions were often referred to as the Iron Legions of Rome.
Their weapons and stuff made of iron.
Their weapons were made of iron. What happens when an iron sword meets a bronze sword?
Breaks the bronze sword.
Breaks a bronze sword. You have a person wearing a bronze breastplate and you whack them with an iron sword. What do you think happens?
Their breastplate's destroyed and they're probably killed.
Breastplate was not much protection against iron. So when you're saying there, they crushed them. I mean, they did. They came through, and they had some good tactics too. I mean, Romans were no slouches when it came to tactics, but they just had the means. They had superior weapons. They had superior manpower, and they weren't afraid to throw it around. And then the Romans united their empire with a system of Roman roads, the worship of Roman gods. An interesting thing, the Romans didn't care who you worshiped, but you had to worship their gods too. You want to worship your gods, that's fine, as long as you worship ours. Roman culture, Roman governors, and a strong, ruthless Roman military that immediately suppressed all opposition. The only punishment they had for any kind of opposition was death. There was no jail where they threw you in and let you rot for life. You died. That was the end of that. So let's read on. We'll get more into the Roman Empire later in Daniel. But let's see what follows the kingdom of iron. So let's read verses 41 through 43. And volunteer.
I'll read it.
All right, thank you, Tyann. Go ahead.
Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay.
Right, interesting. And there's one thing I want to point out in the symbolism here. Can't help myself. The iron legs. Interesting thing about the Roman Empire, we always think of it as one empire, but there was actually two. There was the Eastern Empire and there was a Western Empire. They each had their own Caesar, but they both answered to an emperor who controlled the both. Now, Rome didn't start that way. They grew, and it wasn't until after the time of Christ that they ended up having two capitals, two Caesars. But at the time that the Roman Empire actually collapsed, they had an Eastern capital, which was in Rome, and they had a Western capital, which was in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. All right, so what follows the kingdom of iron?
So,
Nothing.
Well, no, it's not
it's a
nothing. There's
mixture.
something there, but it's not another world empire.
so
Right, it's all
Rome
divided.
divided up into all these different little kingdoms, so to speak.
Different kingdoms, right? So the Empire of Rome fragmented
Yeah.
into all these different kingdoms. And again, keep in mind the symbolism, right? So the sequence of world dominating empires ends with Rome. After Rome, there has not been another world dominating empire. Right? There's been attempts, but none have succeeded.
So not for lack of
Right.
trying.
So notice the prophecy says there would not be a fifth world ruling empire that would follow Rome. Because after Rome, you have the feet of iron mixed with clay, and then the stone comes down and smashes it all to bits. Now, so what happened to Rome? Barbarian tribes attacked the Roman Empire and tore it apart from the inside. Rome was broken into 10 parts, divided up among the 10 tribes. Interesting thing, right? Yeah, how many toes were on that statue?
10 toes.
10 toes. Interesting symbolism. The map of Europe today reflects in part these divisions. And the book goes through where the different tribes are and all that. We're not going to get into that tonight. Eventually, numerous independent nations established themselves within the boundaries of what is today is Western Europe, based largely on how those tribes divided themselves up. Now, there's been some changes on the map since then. Some of those tribes have fragmented themselves into smaller kingdoms and things of that nature. Okay. Now, some of these were strong like iron. Others were brittle and weak like clay. And you can see that through history. There are some kingdoms or countries in Europe that have maintained a certain amount of independence and military strength and have had a bigger part, if you will, on the world stage, while others are just there in the background. And in the wars between them, they kind of get caught in the middle. So these others were brittle and weak like clay, just as the prophecy predicted. These became the forerunners of modern Europe. So what does it mean that they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay? What does that mean for these kingdoms?
Well, they'll never be successfully united again, reunited.
Never be successfully
Not
reunited.
one big empire anymore.
Absolutely
like-
not. Interesting thing, you notice this European Union
Yeah.
was another attempt to do that. And it's not working.
Yeah.
It's not working. They tried to say, well, we can't do it militarily. Let's do it financially. Didn't work.
People keep leaving it. Countries keep leaving it.
Yep. It's just not working. So there would be attempts to bring together these nations of a divided Rome and reunite them into a single world dominating power. The history of Europe is a history of kings arising and attempting to marry off their sons and daughters to the children of kings or other powerful nations in order to unite and 4 major family units that would dominate Europe. Notice, the prince and princesses always have to marry princes and princesses. Right? They can't just marry a commoner. Until recently, very recent times that some of the royals have said enough with that and gone their own way, but they're not really ruling powers anyway, so it doesn't matter at this point. So all these different attempts to maybe intermarry and form alliances have crumbled. It's not unusual to go back in history and see where wars have been fought between kings whose children had intermarried, which has got to make it hard on the kids. Have we seen attempts to unite these divided kingdoms by force?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Nazi
Can
Germany.
we think of some examples?
Hitler.
Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany, all right,
She said
Hitler, all right,
Russia,
Napoleon.
Yes, Russia did.
Russia, okay, Napoleon, Russia. We think of the threat of communism, when it came into Eastern Europe, and it looked like they were threatening Western Europe, and you notice what happened to communism?
It fell apart.
Fell apart
Bonaparte.
But
because
yeah,
it's not sustainable. It's just not.
Napoleon, he came close. Well, I don't want to say super close, but he did come close.
Napoleon came close and he fell apart. Interesting thing from Napoleon, once he was captured and when he was in prison, somebody pointed out this prophecy to Daniel and he was frustrated.
To Napoleon.
Yeah, Napoleon.
You said to Daniel.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, Dan pointed out this prophecy of Daniel to Napoleon. Excuse me. And Napoleon was like, why didn't someone point this out to me like 20 years ago?
Right.
So, but bless his heart. It was just too late for him at that point. Right? So there's been attempts and they've all failed miserably. Why did each of these attempts fail?
Because God said that they weren't going to have a success. I mean, God said
Right.
so. I mean, it's foretold.
God said so. Remember, Daniel said God sets up kingdoms and kings and kingdoms. There's other texts in the Bible where it says God determines the boundaries. Beyond that, you shall not go. You just can't. God will let you go so far, and that's it. So God has predetermined that there won't be, which means that no matter what you do, you're not going to succeed. So what will be the end of all these earthly kingdoms? Let's go to the next 2 verses, verses 44 and 45. I can get another reader. We're getting close to here.
I can.
All right, go ahead.
In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy.
Interesting. So what's going to happen to all the earthly kingdoms?
We're all going to be destroyed.
All going to be destroyed. All of this, everything down here is going to be wiped out. Interesting, he says here, the same God who he says gave this kingdom to you is going to be the same God who destroys all the kingdoms. So God sets up this kingdom, and who's going to rule over it?
He's going to be
He
the
is.
ultimate ruler. Yeah.
Right? He is going to rule over it. God's going to set the kingdom up. Now we know if we read on in the book, he gives rulership to Jesus, who is also God.
God.
So he sets up the kingdom. He's going to rule over it. In what ways is the stone different from the parts of the image shown to the king?
Not a kingdom created by man.
Okay, it's not a kingdom created by man. What else?
It's going to stand forever.
Yeah, it is going to stand forever. Nothing comes after it. Are there any other differences that we saw?
Never going to be destroyed or conquered.
Right? It's going to last forever. So never destroyed, never conquered. Now, I give you a hint here. There's no wrong answers. I don't have a list of things I'm looking for here. I just wanted to throw this out here for input to see what y'all picked up. Sometimes you folks pull out some insights that maybe didn't occur to somebody else. Notice it did say in here that the stone does what after it does this, it grows and fills the whole earth, which is something none of the other kingdoms did. And the stone is not made out of metals that would be
No.
considered, of value in an earthly way.
It's kind of unassuming rock. I mean, because when I don't picture anything special about it. It's just a rock. And it's destroying all these kingdoms that, even the head of gold that is supposedly this wonderful, like a precious metal that everybody's always seeking for, but it's this really unassuming rock that comes in and destroys all the kingdoms.
Yep.
Hmm.
It doesn't fall after the pattern of earthly values.
Right.
Right? It has its own set of values. Okay. So based on this vision, where do we currently stand in the course of the history portrayed here?
Toes.
Toes.
Toes. Which I've heard people say we're in the toenails. They want to get specific. We're in the toenails.
Yeah.
Definitely in the foot portion,
Yeah.
whether it be the toes, the toenails, the toe knuckle, wherever you want to put it in there, right? We're definitely in what we would consider to be the latter days, the latter portion of this vision, right? Virtually everything has happened according to this prophecy, except for one thing. And what's that?
Giant stone coming down and crushing everything.
The giant stone coming down and crushing everything. It's the only thing that has not yet been fulfilled. So what are some of the assurances we can take from this dream and its interpretation? And again, there's no wrong answers here. I don't have a set list of things I'm looking for. What are some assurances that you feel you can take away from this?
God is in control.
God is in control. That's a big one
Yeah.
for me.
His kingdom is not going to end. He knows what's going to happen. He has plans, and we just need to trust in those plans.
I do like the fact that his kingdom will never end. I mean, how
Yeah.
reassuring would it be if God says, this big stone comes down here, fills the earth and rules for 1,000 years, and then things go back to the way it was.
No, that would not be good.
That'd be very reassuring. No. No, not very reassuring at all. Right? Anything else?
Well, how accurate it is in history. We can read in history books
Yeah.
what we're reading here in our Bible. So the kingdoms all came to pass. There was wars and all that actually happened, predicted right here in Daniel.
Absolutely. And as we get into some of the prophecies later in the book, we're going to see some prophecies that are even more specific than these.
Mhm.
Now, if God is able to predict the future, get all the details right over several thousands of years, right? Can we trust his word?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. He's able to tell us exactly what's going to happen. We can look back and see that it has happened. So if we can trust that, then we can trust anything we read in here. There's no reason to doubt anything that's in this book. So that's another assurance I have. I can trust God's word.
Yeah.
All right. So now let's take a look. Now that Daniel's done, let's get the finale. How did the king react to the interpretation when completed? There's some interesting reactions here.
Yeah.
Verses 46 through 49. Isaiah. I'm like, that does not look right. All right. I'm going to read these. So I read the beginning. I'll read the end. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. Now, bear in mind, in that day, in that culture, who did the king bow to?
Nobody.
No one.
Nobody. King didn't bow to anybody. The king would go to the temple. He didn't even bow to his idols. but he bowed here for Daniel. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods. So big G, then little g. So your God is the God of everybody. He ruled even my own gods, he's saying. The Lord of kings and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts. So Daniel's no longer an intern, right? And gave him many great gifts. So interesting. Remember, I asked that question earlier. What were some of the rewards that Daniel might have been tempted by if he had been unfaithful and claimed the credit for himself? Well, he was faithful and he's still getting the rewards, right? And he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So they were now all his staff. I think that's interesting. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So interesting. So how did the king react, and why do you think he reacted that way?
They react with worshiping, trying to worship Daniel. I'm sure Daniel was like, no.
Not Daniel.
No, it says well, the way it says is he commanded, they said prostrate before Daniel. So it's like, and present an offering and incense to him. So it sounds like trying to worship to me.
He's used to worshiping gods through idols, through priests, through offerings to the idols and priests. He is honoring God in the only way he knows how at this point in time, through his servant Daniel, who he has recognized. Now notice, he made him basically, you're my number one guy, which makes you number two in the kingdom. I'm still over you. So I'm not worshiping you, but I'm worshiping your God. So he was trying to worship the God in heaven. Through Daniel's powerful witness, the king's heart was convicted by God's Spirit and was overwhelmed by his unequivocal truth. Now, don't confuse this for conversion. He is not converted at this point, but he does believe now in the power of God. The kneeling, the offering, and the incense, that was all about worship. The king was beginning to know God and did what he could to offer adoration to him through his servant Daniel. So what lesson is there for us in this turn of events? There's some lessons in there. And again, I'm looking for your takeaways, not my takeaways.
You mean on everything we've read for the lesson?
Well, through this turn of events, what happened here? Just from this turn of events where the king went from, threatening to kill everybody to now he's bowing before Daniel, giving offerings and worshiping God through Daniel.
We should be a witness.
We should be a witness, okay? So Daniel was a witness, right? How was Daniel a witness?
He gave all the glory to God. He didn't claim any of the credit himself. He let the king know, he let Nebuchadnezzar know this is coming, this interpretation is coming to you from my God. This is nothing from me. And my God wanted you to know what was coming up. So this is all him. This is all God. This is not me.
All right, so I like that one. That's a good one. So Daniel gave credit to God. Daniel also remained faithful to God through what we've read so far in these first two chapters. He purposed in his heart to remain true to God. Daniel made himself available to God. Right? In other words, he allowed God to use him where he was. What else did Daniel do?
He remembered his friends.
He remembered his friends.
He didn't take all the credit. He knew his friends had helped with praying and everything. And so he remembered those three friends so that they could be rewarded also. He didn't take all the glory, all the prizes, all the whatever from the king. He wanted it shared with his friends who had stood by him and prayed with him.
Mhm. Now, when Daniel got into the situation where he would be going before the king, who told him what to say?
I mean, like who told him the interpretation? God.
Yeah, who gave him all this? God did,
God
right?
did.
He went to God, yeah. And then
Right,
he and his
so-
friends prayed.
Now, this is important for people who are living in the last days. There's going to be times when you're going to be called upon to witness in situations that may be uncomfortable. Just like God gave Daniel the wisdom and the words that he needed for that place and time, God will give us. And there's actually promises in the Bible where Jesus says, do not fear what to say, right? For the Spirit will bring to mind the things that you need.
But you have to study first. You can't just go through life
Well, no,
without any.
you got to be like Daniel, purpose in his heart, right? He knew God's word. He spent time with God.
Yes.
He had that constant line of communication. You can't be like those people. Well, no, well, when the going gets tough, I'm going to toe the line at that point. Up until then, I'm going to go a little bit over here. I'm just stray a little bit over the fence. Problem with that is you start straying a little bit over the fence, before long, you can't even see the fence anymore. You're so far gone. So you got to be careful about that. Any other lessons anyone else got out of that? No? Okay, move on. So let the faithful never underestimate what God is able to accomplish through their consecrated service. See, Daniel was essentially a slave, but he came in, he surrendered to God, allowed God to use him, and God has actually been able to reach this heathen king. And in addition to that, he has Daniel and his other 3 faithful friends in positions of influence within the kingdom so that they can continue to be a witness for him. God can do the same with us. So how did the king reward Daniel and his friends? Well, we've already talked about that.
Promoted him.
Promoted
that
him?
was a really big promotion too. Because I mean, like you said, he wasn't living in the palace. He was outside the walls, or not walls, but outside the palace a ways. And suddenly to go from super junior all of a sudden to ruler over all these places.
Essentially, Daniel became the king's chief advisor at this point in time.
Yeah, like overnight. Overnight.
And when we read through these later chapters, we'll see that Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar do develop a bit of a relationship, where the king takes his counsel, the king trusts him and relies on him. And he'll continue that in later chapters. So we'll get to reading that. And I do believe that by the end, you'll see that Nebuchadnezzar is converted. And I fully believe that he'll be in the kingdom, but it's a process. He goes through some stages. He makes some major epic stumbles along the way, which we will read. So when you think, and this is discussion question, so we're right at the end here. When you think of the soon coming of Christ, do you think of condemnation or salvation? Put yourself in Nebuchadnezzar's place. When he thought of that stone, smashing that statue to bits, you think he was thinking of condemnation or salvation?
Most probably condemnation.
Condemnation. He saw a stone that was going to shatter and destroy his kingdom. Right? There was no salvation in that image to him. Why is that?
He didn't know God yet. He didn't have that relationship.
He did not know God yet. Right? How do you think Daniel saw the stone?
Salvation. He saw the coming of God's kingdom. I mean, he was gonna, yeah.
He saw the coming of God's kingdom, and he knew. This is not he not believed. He knew that he was going to have a part in that kingdom. Right. So in what ways does the rock follow you in the spiritual wilderness of your life? So when that rock, if you think about that rock and it's coming down one day, is that something that follows you around? Is that something you think about?
When Christ, his second coming, yes.
right, so does
I
it give
look at it as I follow the rock.
follow the rock? Yeah, not the rock following you around.
Right.
I mean, it's
I
in
try
my
to follow the
thoughts.
rock.
Yeah. So when I wrote this, in what ways does the rock follow you in your spiritual life? I'm thinking, how does the concept, the thoughts, belief, the understanding of what that rock represents, how does that follow you around in the spiritual world? And absolutely right. You follow the rock. As we know, the rock is Jesus. Right?
Mhm.
You follow him. But that should be on your forethoughts, Again, is what I'm doing today, is it hastening that coming rock? Am I helping to build that kingdom that's going to grow and fill the earth? Right? Am I making my place in that kingdom secure? Or are the things I'm doing detracting from that kingdom or leading me astray from that kingdom? Those are questions that we should be asking ourselves. That's really because when it gets down to it, the only thing that matters on this earth is whether or not you're doing the things and taking the actions that will ensure your spot in God's kingdom and help to build that kingdom. Everything else is true. And this is a question you don't have to answer. This is just a thought question for you to think about. Do you have a piece in that rock? Will your anchor hold and grip the solid rock? That's the end of our discussion for today. Next week, we're going to be studying Daniel chapter 3. Interesting, the way chapter 2 ends and the way chapter 3 begins, you're going to be asking yourself, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in between? The man went off his rockers. But it's going to be a great lesson. I'm looking forward to it. And let's close this one out with prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the true assurance we have in your word. We thank you for the gift and understanding that you've given us through your prophecies, that we may know the future before it happens. More importantly, that we can be reassured that you are in control. We look forward, Lord, to the coming of the rock, the establishment of your kingdom. We pray, Lord, that we may all be there with you and that we may bring others along with us. Lord, we ask that you will be with us as we go our separate ways. Help us to draw closer to you and to be a witness to others in this world. We thank you for asking these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Amen.